you got to win the midterms, because if we don't win the midterms, it's just going to be, they'll find a reason to impeach me. I'll get impeached.
Donald Trump just admitted what sources are calling the most explicit confession yet, that he's planning to interfere with the 2026 midterm elections, and the scheme he might be implementing could make everything that happened in 2020 look like amateur hour by comparison. We're not talking about just spreading lies about fraud or pressuring officials to change results. We're talking about reports that Trump has expressed regret about not seizing voting machines with military force after the last election he lost. That he's allegedly talked multiple times about canceling the midterms entirely. That his ICE operations in Democratic cities might be designed to create conditions justifying deployment of National Guard troops to polling places in November. And sources suggest the entire strategy could involve invoking the Insurrection Act to give himself authority to override governors and mayors, put federal troops anywhere he wants, and create conditions where voting in Democratic strongholds becomes impossible through intimidation and military presence. If those assessments are accurate, Americans aren't just facing typical voter suppression tactics. They might be watching real-time implementation of plan to ensure Republicans don't lose Congress, regardless of how Americans actually vote. But before we break down how Trump's stated regrets about 2020 might reveal his plans for 2026, real quick, you cannot trust mainstream media to explain what it means when a president openly discusses canceling elections and regretting not using military force to seize voting equipment. That's why we built John Brown Show, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want analysis that actually connects Trump's ICE operations to potential election interference through Insurrection Act deployment, hit that subscribe button right now. Because what Trump is allegedly planning for November could determine whether America still has functioning democracy by the end of this year. Your subscription actually matters here. All right, let's get into what Trump has actually said and what sources suggest those statements might reveal about his intentions. Because this isn't speculation about what he might do based on past behavior. Reports indicate Trump has explicitly told people he regrets not seizing voting machines with National Guard after 2020, that he's joked, or maybe not joked, about canceling the 2026 elections, that he's told Republicans if they lose the midterms, he'll be impeached. When you combine those statements with the ICE operations creating chaos in Democratic cities, with his administration's demands that states surrender voter data, with deployment of federal forces operating under questionable legal authority, a pattern allegedly emerges. Trump might be engineering conditions that would justify invoking the Insurrection Act before November. And once that act is invoked, sources suggest he gains authority to deploy military forces anywhere, override state and local officials, and potentially station troops at polling places in ways that could suppress Democratic turnout enough to ensure Republicans maintain control, regardless of how unpopular their policies have become. If that's the actual plan, Americans aren't just facing election. They might be facing last chance to stop authoritarian seizure of democratic process. Let's start with documenting what Trump has actually said about elections and his regrets about how he handled 2020. Because sources suggest these aren't just casual comments. They might be Trump revealing his actual thinking about what he wishes he'd done and what he might be planning to do differently this time. Reports indicate Trump gave an interview to the New York Times where he expressed regret about not directing National Guard to seize voting machines after the 2020 election in search of evidence of fraud. Think about what that statement reveals. Trump isn't saying he regrets the way he questioned the results or the rhetoric he used. He's allegedly saying he regrets not using military force to physically take control of voting equipment. That's not normal political regret about messaging or strategy. That's regret about not deploying troops to seize democratic infrastructure. And the implication might be that he's determined not to make that same mistake again. That if he faces unfavorable election results in 2026, he'll be more willing to use military force to challenge them. And sources suggest Trump has also talked multiple times about canceling the 2026 elections. Reports indicate he mentioned it at the Kennedy Center and in a Reuters interview. His press secretary allegedly claimed he was joking when he suggested they're doing such a great job. Maybe they should just keep rolling without elections. But when reporter pressed about whether Trump finds canceling elections funny, the press secretary got defensive and hostile rather than clearly stating Trump believes in democratic process. Make sure you're subscribed to John Brown Show because think about what those exchanges reveal. Trump's team doesn't unequivocally deny he wants to cancel elections. They claim he's joking, but presidents don't joke about canceling democracy. And when pressed on whether it's appropriate to joke about something generations of Americans died to protect, Trump's spokesperson attacks the questioner rather than defending democratic principles. That suggests Trump might not actually be joking. He might be testing public reaction to idea of canceling elections to see if he can normalize the concept before attempting it. And there's reportedly another explicit admission that reveals Trump's mindset. He told Republican members of Congress that if they lose the midterms, he'll get impeached. That's Trump acknowledging that evidence exists to impeach him, that only Republican control of Congress protects him from accountability, that he understands the stakes of the midterms are his personal survival. When someone facing that kind of jeopardy expresses regret about not using military force to challenge previous election results, that suggests he might be willing to use that force to prevent outcome he fears. But here's where Trump's various schemes might connect into coherent strategy. Sources suggest the ICE operations in Minneapolis and potentially other cities aren't primarily about immigration enforcement. They could be designed to create conditions that justify invoking the Insurrection Act before the midterm elections. And once that act is invoked, Trump allegedly gains sweeping authority to deploy military forces in ways that could interfere with voting. Reports indicate the pattern works like this: deploy ICE and Border Patrol agents to Democratic cities using aggressive tactics that provoke resistance. Characterize any protests or resistance as insurrection or terrorism. Use that characterization to claim cities are out of control and state governments can't maintain order. Invoke Insurrection Act, claiming federal intervention is necessary to restore peace. Deploy National Guard troops under federal control to those cities, and then have those troops stationed at or near polling places in November claiming they're necessary for election security. Think about what happens if troops are present at polling places in Democratic strongholds. Even if they're not explicitly preventing people from voting, their presence intimidates voters. Sources suggest studies show military or police presence at polling locations suppresses turnout, particularly among minority communities who might already have fraught relationships with law enforcement. If Trump can depress Democratic turnout by even 10 or 15% in key cities through intimidation, that could be enough to swing close House races and maintain Republican control. And there's allegedly another element to the strategy. If troops take possession of voting machines or other election equipment under Insurrection Act authority, that breaks chain of custody. Sources indicate election officials maintain careful protocols about who can access voting equipment and under what circumstances. If federal troops under presidential control suddenly have access to voting machines, that creates opportunity for tampering that might be impossible to detect or prove. And at minimum, it casts doubt on election integrity in ways Trump could exploit to challenge unfavorable results. Share this video with everyone you know because reports suggest there's also pressure component. Trump administration has allegedly told states like Minnesota that ICE will leave if state governments hand over voter rolls and other election data. That connects immigration enforcement directly to gaining control over election administration. And if pattern spreads to multiple swing states, Trump could potentially leverage ICE operations to gain access to voter information and election systems that he could use to challenge results or suppress turnout in November. But let's talk about what the Insurrection Act actually is and why sources suggest it's so dangerous if Trump invokes it. Because this isn't widely understood law, but it could become the mechanism through which Trump attempts to override federalism and deploy military force to influence elections. Reports indicate the Insurrection Act dates back to 1807 and gives presidents authority to deploy military forces domestically under certain circumstances. The law allegedly allows presidents to use military to suppress insurrection, rebellion, or situations where state authorities can't maintain order. And crucially, sources suggest the president has broad discretion about when those conditions exist. Courts have historically been reluctant to second-guess presidential invocations of the act, which means if Trump claims conditions exist justifying its use, he might face few legal obstacles to deploying troops even if the underlying justification is questionable. Think about what authority that creates. Once Insurrection Act is invoked, sources indicate President can deploy military forces to any location he designates, can override state governors and local mayors who object to the deployment, can use those forces to take control of state and local functions claimed to be related to restoring order, and courts might not intervene to stop it because they defer to presidential judgments about national security and domestic order. And here's what makes this particularly dangerous for elections. If Trump invokes the act claiming Democratic cities are experiencing insurrection or unrest and deploys National Guard troops to those locations, those troops could theoretically be stationed at polling places claiming to provide security. Sources suggest state and local election officials might have limited ability to prevent that deployment because federal authority under Insurrection Act potentially supersedes state control. And the presence of federal troops under presidential command at polling places creates obvious opportunity for intimidation and interference. Even more, the Insurrection Act doesn't require congressional approval. The president can invoke it unilaterally based on his assessment of conditions. That means Trump doesn't need Republican Congress to authorize deployment of troops to cities before November. He just needs to claim conditions justify it. And given his pattern of lying about threats and creating chaos he then uses as justification for expanded powers, sources suggest he could manufacture the pretext for invoking the act even if actual insurrection doesn't exist. But here's where sources suggest Trump's strategy becomes particularly insidious. The chaos that would justify invoking the Insurrection Act isn't naturally occurring. It might be deliberately engineered through federal operations designed to provoke exactly the kind of resistance that Trump can then characterize as insurrection. And understanding that dynamic helps explain why ICE operations have been so provocative and why Trump might want them to generate backlash. Reports indicate the Minneapolis operations were conducted in ways that maximized confrontation. Agents allegedly wearing masks making identification difficult, using tactics that civil rights groups characterize as constitutional violations, killing American citizens and then lying about what happened. All of that creates conditions for protests and resistance, and Trump can then point to those protests and claim the city is experiencing insurrection that requires federal military intervention. Think about how this serves Trump's purposes. He needs justification for deploying troops before November. He can't just station National Guard at polling places without explanation, because that would be too obviously election interference. But if he can claim Democratic cities are experiencing violent insurrection that local authorities can't control, suddenly troop deployment seems like legitimate response to crisis. And if those troops happen to be present during elections, that's just coincidental to their primary mission of maintaining order. And sources suggest this pattern could repeat in multiple cities: Philadelphia, Phoenix, Detroit, Milwaukee. All potential targets for ICE operations designed to provoke resistance that Trump characterizes as insurrection. Each operation creates additional justification for Insurrection Act invocation. Each city with federal troops becomes location where Democratic turnout might be suppressed through intimidation. The cumulative effect could swing enough House races to maintain Republican control, even if Democrats would win under normal voting conditions. But there's reportedly another element. Even if Trump doesn't actually invoke Insurrection Act, the threat of it creates pressure on Democratic governors and mayors. If they know resistance to ICE operations might trigger federal military deployment, they might be more compliant with Trump's demands for voter data or other concessions. The threat of troops at polling places becomes leverage to extract election-related concessions from states Trump needs to control to maintain power. When Americans see federal troops deployed domestically, when they witness ICE operations that look like military campaigns, When Trump talks about canceling elections and regretting not seizing voting machines, it normalizes the idea that democratic processes might not continue normally. That conditions some citizens to accept authoritarian measures as inevitable rather than recognizing they could resist them. And that psychological surrender might be as important to Trump's strategy as actual troop deployments. But let's talk about why Trump might be so desperate to maintain Republican control of Congress that he'd risk implementing scheme involving military interference with elections. Because sources suggest the answer reveals just how serious his legal and political jeopardy could be if Democrats gain investigative power. Reports indicate Trump himself has told Republicans he expects to be impeached if they lose the House. That's explicit acknowledgement of his vulnerability. And there are good reasons for that vulnerability. Sources suggest Jack Smith's testimony provided roadmap for impeachment backed by prosecutorial findings. Evidence exists about Trump's conduct on January 6th and regarding classified documents. Multiple potential criminal charges remain, despite cases being dismissed due to him being sitting president. If Democrats gain House control, they could pursue impeachment immediately using Smith's testimony as foundation. They could subpoena witnesses Trump has blocked, could force production of documents he's hidden, could build public record of his misconduct that makes conviction in Senate more politically viable. Think about what happens if Trump gets impeached again with Democrats holding comprehensive hearings, months of testimony documenting his crimes, evidence being presented to public, media coverage focusing on accountability rather than just chaos. That damages him politically in ways that might be impossible to recover from. And if Senate Republicans calculate that removing Trump serves their interests better than defending him through scandals, conviction becomes possible. That's the outcome Trump fears enough to potentially interfere with elections to prevent. But there's reportedly another element. Democratic House control means investigations into everyone in Trump's orbit. Elon Musk's potential crimes and conflicts of interest, cabinet officials' misconduct, family members' corruption. All of it becomes subject to congressional subpoena power. Sources suggest commentators are already predicting Democrats would haul numerous Trump associates before Congress to document what crimes they committed. That level of scrutiny and exposure could destroy political viability of Trump's entire movement if evidence is as damaging as critics suggest. And now there's also the Supreme Court immunity question. Sources indicate Trump is relying on Supreme Court decision giving presidents broad immunity from prosecution. But Democratic House could challenge that decision by impeaching Trump specifically to establish that such immunity is inconsistent with constitutional accountability. And they could promise to pack the court if Republicans continue shielding Trump from consequences. That threatens the legal protection Trump thinks insulates him from prosecution, making maintaining Republican House control even more critical to his survival. But while Trump might be planning election interference through Insurrection Act deployment, sources suggest there are practical obstacles that could prevent the scheme from succeeding. And understanding those obstacles helps identify where resistance might be most effective. Reports indicate that despite presidential authority under Insurrection Act, there are legal and practical barriers to using military at polling places. Federal law allegedly prohibits military personnel from being stationed at polling places in ways that interfere with voting. Troops can't block access to polls, can't question voters, can't take possession of voting equipment without specific authorization. Even under Insurrection Act, those restrictions might limit how Trump can deploy forces during elections. Though sources suggest he could argue security necessities override those restrictions if conditions are chaotic enough. And there's reportedly resistance within military itself. Career military officers might refuse orders they view as unconstitutional or as using armed forces for partisan election interference. Not all National Guard units would necessarily comply with federal deployment orders if state governors object. Military lawyers might advise commanders that proposed deployments violate law. All of that creates friction that could prevent smooth implementation of Trump's scheme even if he tries executing it. Think about state-level resistance. Democratic governors could refuse to activate their National Guard units for federal service, could challenge Insurrection Act invocation in court arguing conditions don't justify it, could deploy state law enforcement to protect polling places from federal interference, could work with election officials to ensure voting proceeds despite federal presence. Sources suggest each of those actions creates additional obstacles Trump would need to overcome to successfully interfere with elections through troop deployment. But there's reportedly also public opinion factor. If Trump deploys troops to polling places, that would generate massive backlash from Democrats and potentially even some Republicans concerned about military interference with democracy. Media coverage would be intense. International observers might condemn it as authoritarian power grab. That political cost might deter Trump from the most aggressive versions of his scheme, even if technically possible. Though sources note Trump has shown willingness to weather enormous criticism when he believes his survival depends on it. Invoking Insurrection Act requires claiming conditions of insurrection exist. If Trump tries invoking it months before November, courts might have time to review and potentially block deployment. If he waits until days before elections, there might not be time for legal challenges to stop troop deployment before voting occurs. That timing calculation could determine whether his scheme succeeds or gets blocked by legal and practical obstacles. So what can Democrats and concerned citizens do if Trump is actually planning to interfere with midterm elections through Insurrection Act deployment and troops at polling places? Because sources suggest there are strategies for preventing the scheme or mitigating its impact even if Trump attempts implementation. First, continued pressure on ICE operations helps prevent them from being used as pretext for claiming insurrection exists. If Minneapolis-style operations can't be expanded to other cities because public backlash is too intense, Trump loses the justification he needs for invoking the act. And reports indicate documentation remains crucial. If Trump claims cities are experiencing violent insurrection, video evidence showing peaceful protests contradicts that narrative. Sources suggest media and citizen journalists need to comprehensively document what's actually happening, so Trump can't lie about conditions the way Bovino lied about protesters being terrorists. That documentation can be used in court challenges to Insurrection Act invocations and in public messaging about Trump's true intentions. But there's reportedly also need for legal preparation. Democratic attorneys general and civil rights organizations could prepare lawsuits challenging any Insurrection Act invocation as pretextual and unconstitutional, could seek injunctions blocking troop deployments to polling places, could argue that even if act is validly invoked, using it to interfere with elections exceeds presidential authority. Getting those challenges filed immediately upon any deployment could create legal obstacles that prevent scheme from succeeding, even if Trump tries it. Think about electoral strategy implications. If Trump might interfere with voting in certain Democratic cities, that makes voter mobilization in areas he can't easily suppress even more critical. Sources suggest Democrats might need to overperform in rural and suburban areas to compensate for potential suppression in urban centers. That requires resources and strategy focused on maximizing turnout, where conditions will be most favorable regardless of what Trump does in cities. Make sure you're subscribed because there's also messaging challenge. Democrats need to communicate what Trump might be planning without sounding like conspiracy theorists. Sources suggest pointing to Trump's own words about regretting not seizing voting machines and talking about canceling elections, noting that he's engineering chaos in Democratic cities that could justify Insurrection Act, explaining what that act allows and why troops at polls would suppress turnout, making the threat concrete using Trump's own statements rather than speculation helps voters understand stakes without seeming paranoid. So here's what Trump's statements and actions reveal about his potential midterm scheme. Explicit regret about not using military force to seize voting machines after 2020. Repeated discussions about canceling the 2026 elections. ICE operations creating chaos in Democratic cities that could justify Insurrection Act invocation. Pattern of demanding states surrender voter data in exchange for ending federal operations. And direct statement that he expects impeachment if Republicans lose the House, establishing his desperate motivation to prevent that outcome regardless of how Americans actually vote. The implications for American democracy couldn't be more serious. If Trump successfully invokes Insurrection Act and deploys troops to polling places in Democratic strongholds, turnout could be suppressed enough to maintain Republican House control despite Democrats winning under normal conditions. If troops gain access to voting equipment, chain of custody breaks and results become challengeable. If his scheme succeeds, November might not be free and fair election, but rather authoritarian manipulation of democratic process to ensure outcome Trump needs for his survival. The obstacles to Trump's scheme are real. Legal restrictions on military at polling places, potential resistance from military officers and state governors, public backlash that could be intense, court challenges that might block deployments. But Trump has shown willingness to push boundaries and violate norms when he believes his survival depends on it. And with his own statements revealing he thinks losing the House means impeachment, his motivation to risk everything on election interference scheme might override normal political calculations. The question is whether Americans recognize the threat and resist effectively enough to prevent it. Whether the chaos Trump is engineering in cities gets called out as pretextual rather than accepted as justifying federal military intervention. Whether courts move quickly enough to block unconstitutional deployments. Whether voters turn out in numbers too large to be suppressed even through intimidation. The next several months could determine whether America's democratic institutions survive or whether Trump successfully implements authoritarian seizure of electoral process using military force he regretted not deploying in 2020. Stay tuned.